there seems to be a little bit of a worrying trend developing with councils not adhering to LGSCO recommendations around compensation and things like that. There was a case involving Leicester City Council, I think just before Christmas, and there was one last week from Hounslow where basically the LGSCO did a specific kind of news update about it. The Leicester one involved a situation where there was a family in B&B for over 6 weeks, which basically means that you're already in the ballpark of getting compensation. And the LGO had investigated and found fault, causing significant injustice, and recommended a payment of compensation. I'll put the links to these, by the way, in the description if you want to find out more. And Leicester Council basically said, we haven't got the housing and we haven't got the money, quite frankly, to pay, so we're not going to. And then more recently, this Hounslow case that came out last week involved a domestic abuse survivor who'd been royally screwed around, gate kept, and all sorts of things had happened. And one of the recommendations was that the council paid compensation, which I think they did. But another recommendation was that basically that she was put number one on the list to get housed, and they refused to do that. And it's worth reading the whole judgment really, but it just kind of makes the point that the LGSCO has no formal authority over councils, although 99% of the time councils follow them. So I have seen cases before where the LGSCO, their recommendations haven't been followed by council, but that's more because the council just basically disagreed with the LGO's investigation, rather than just saying, yeah, we accept the findings, but we're just not going to pay, or we're not going to kind of do the recommended steps. And it makes the point, it kind of brings the fact in there. It kind of says, we hope the councillors of, in this case, Hounslow Council, are going to make amends and basically sort this out and make sure that the council does comply with these recommendations. And it can seem pretty miserable, really, I guess, if you're an advocate out there and you're seeing councils, break the law all the time. When they rarely do get caught, we're now seeing these kind of situations where they're just basically refusing to pay. And so the danger, I think, is that other councils will see Leicester and Hounslow not comply with the LGSCO recommendations and kind of think, well, there's no real consequences for that. We haven't got any money, we can justify it, so we're basically not going to pay, or we're not going to kind of do the things that the LGSCO have told us to do. And I think the only defence, now I guess, as I say, it can be pretty miserable, but I think there is a good defence against this, and that is simply organising local people. So if you're living in Hounslow, if you're living in Leicester, it doesn't actually take that many people. It takes a handful of well-informed people who are committed and kind of going to be in it for the long haul to completely change the way in which homelessness is dealt with. So I talked about length in Bedford before. In Bedford, there's only a handful of us that do this sort of stuff. And yet there was a period in time when more than half of the work programme of the Housing Committee was basically the stuff we'd been asking for. And so you can have a great deal of influence if you just ask, good questions based on your experiences or your clients' experiences. And you don't have to be kind of confrontational about it. You can be very kind of gentle about it. But in Hounslow, as an example, it would be useful for a member of the public to go to the full council committee, the next full council committee, and say, this is the LGSCO's findings. What is the council's opinion about complying with the recommendations from the LGSCO? It makes it much more difficult to shrug off. You're also going to potentially have local democracy reporters in those meetings who then report it to the local press, and all of a sudden it starts kind of gaining more momentum. Because I think, again, it can be an issue which councillors feel their jobs are at risk, not jobs, but their positions are at risk come the next election if they have been involved in a situation which essentially ignored LGSCO findings with homeless people who most of us would have a lot of sympathy with. So I think that's the only answer I can see, other than central government basically giving the LGSCO more powers, which wouldn't be a bad thing either, or potentially kind of increasing the fines as well. I know that kind of runs counter to what I'm saying in the video because councils aren't paying the fines at all. But actually, kind of, if they had more power, if they had more clout behind them, then you're going to find councils are more worried about being caught breaking the law. Because as I say, at the moment, if you get caught breaking the law, which is already unlikely, often the compensation you have to pay is actually less than what you'd have to pay anyway. So, in the LGSCO, in the Leicester case, for example, the families were housed in B&B accommodation for more than 6 weeks because there was nothing else alternative available for them. And so they kind of said, okay, well, we're going to run the risk of, potentially having to pay compensation down the line and just keep people in these situations because we have no cheaper options than these at the moment. So that's kind of how it all works, really. So, I think I haven't yet found a kind of a way of articulating this particularly well, to be honest. But I would say that, in a time when in England we're seeing a lot of things, really kind of serious things, kind of falling apart to some level. So things like housing supply, that would be a good example, but not just that, kind of things like disability benefit cuts, that sort of thing. if you are bothered about that sort of stuff and you haven't yet engaged politically with your local council, then you're missing a trick. Let's kind of put it nicely. For me, I find there's a lot of people out there who will get very outraged on social media, but they won't go to a council meeting to actually kind of do anything about it. And getting outraged on social media just does nothing these days, really. So I think, you don't have to go in there guns blazing. You can go to a council meeting and simply ask a gentle question like, how many kids are in TA right now? Now, that information is publicly available, but by asking the question in that committee meeting, you are going to see how the committee meeting works. You're going to get familiar with it. You're probably going to see which councillors kind of pipe up and kind of take an interest in it, which you can then kind of go and have a coffee with them, whatever, go to one of their surgeries. And the answer itself will just kind of raise consciousness within that committee, within that council, of this fact. And so just by getting simple questions like that asked, already you are informing that committee and actually getting them to actually look at more important things than they'd otherwise look at. We've done videos on the channel, looking at kind of example questions and stuff like that. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can do that is very effective. Again, we've seen it in Bedford many, many times where we've asked questions which have directly then led to being, kind of listened to and actually kind of put in, solved in some way, basically. So, yeah, I think it's easy to get despondent when we're seeing these LGSCO decisions get ignored by councils who are basically saying we can't afford it. But they can afford it, really. Councils don't improve their practices because of LGSCO recommendations of compensation, because, as I say, it's cheaper to pay the money than it is to do the job properly in the first place. It's the political leverage you get from members of the public seeing that their council's getting criticised by the LGSCO. Councillors do not want that in any way, shape or form. And so if you just simply make a step into that kind of world and start engaging with councillors at that level, and MPs, although they're less useful in this setting, you're going to find that you're going to get some good, some useful stuff.